Okay. All right, let's call this meeting to order. Rick, it's good to see you. I think we still have some people coming in, and sure we'll have some students coming from class joining us momentarily, but I think most of you in this room know who I am, but just in case a few of you might not, I'm Jim Hollifield, the director of the Tower Center here at SMU. And I want to welcome you to this. Stuart, you guys, there's seats down here, plenty of space. This is I think maybe the first program we're doing in this semester. There will be many, many more to come. And we've had some difficulties in the Middle East. I think it's safe to say. And fortunately, we have a very active Middle East program at SMU, thanks to the leadership of people like Ambassador Jordan, who's up here to chair this session, Sabri Atesh, my colleague, Ray Rafidi. So we filled that gap here at SMU in bringing programs about the Middle East, but not just the Middle East. As many of you can see, the Tower Center covers the globe. We have lots of programming on Japan and East Asia. We're going to be doing more things on Europe. And with our sister center, Texas-Mexico Center, we do lots on Mexico and Latin America. So there's not a corner of the globe that we don't touch upon. But in order to leave plenty of time for discussion, I want to very quickly just recognize a few people who are here. Most of you know something about academia and private universities. We have to have very powerful support from our alumni and outsiders, and we have 3 members of the Tower Center board who are with us here today who support what we do in the center, helping us bring these programs to both the community, but also, of course, here to the students and the faculty at SMU. So I want to recognize Jean Tower Cox over here, who is, she and I have been at this for a number of years, and I think we've made some progress over those years, Jean. Of course, Julia Simon, who's here on the front row, who's a relatively new member of our board, and I should not forget the vice chairman of our board, Ambassador Robert Jordan. And speaking of Bob Jordan, many of you know Bob, as he's known to most of us. He is the Tower Center diplomat in residence, which is a very important role here for the center and at SMU. He agreed to sort of come a little bit out of retirement this semester to come and teach a course again on Middle East politics for our students. I think some of them are actually probably in attendance today. I think he has a class this afternoon. And he's back, I should say, by popular demand. The students just want to see him back, in the classroom. They love his classes. So, Bob is on the board of the Middle East Institute. I can't know if you're the chair or vice chair of the board of the Middle East Institute. I seem to remember Wendy Chamberlain and lots of people going back 20 years or more, the very close collaboration institutional relationship we've had with the Middle East Institute. So Bob is going to introduce our very special guest, Paul Salem, about as close as I can get, maybe Salem to do it in English. And Paul, I think many of you in here said you know him from his many media appearances. Somebody said they're always watching Al Jazeera, and Paul is very often on commenting on what's going on. And Ambassador Jordan is going to introduce our guests in more detail in just a moment. But I just wanted one little quick brief anecdote. I started graduate studies in the late 70s, working on the Middle East. And I remember a book that we had to read, which had been published, I think, in 1975. And the book and the preface and the introduction, it said, "And we have the fabulously stable consociational democracy of Lebanon." A great example of a country that's stable, where people get together, live together. And of course, 6 months later, when I was studying the Middle East, the Civil War, in Lebanon begin. So it's been something of a tragic history. So let me now turn it over. Why don't we give them a hand and welcome them, and I'll ask Bob to come to the stage.
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome my friend Paul Salem, as I say it, here again to SMU, not your first rodeo here. And Paul has really developed a distinguished career in scholarship and analysis, both with the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he grew up. His father was foreign minister of Lebanon at one time. And he has a wealth of experience, both academic and practical, that I think we can draw on today. Paul, I'm reminded of a scene in that musical of several years ago called The Wiz. And the woman wakes up from her nap and she says, "Please don't bring me no bad news." So try not to bring us too much bad news today as we start off our discussion.
Okay.
And the easy part would be, tell us, just describe what Lebanon is and what it was like to grow up there. It's a beautiful city, a beautiful country, beautiful city, Beirut. Tell us just a snippet about it.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Jordan, and thank you, Dr. Holyfield and Ray and Sabri and everybody here. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an opening question is what is this thing called Lebanon? What is Lebanon? And sort of in a quick overview, it's a very old place, like many things in the Middle East. Its component parts are a number of religious communities, the Maronite community, the Druze community, the Shiite community, and historically, from the times of the Ottoman Empire and previous empires, from at least the dawn of Islam, communities were organized sort of in terms of religious communities. When I say it's old, the Maronite community has been there since the 7th century in the mountains of Lebanon, originally escaping the Byzantines, but then escaping sort of Muslim empires of various types. The Druze have been there for about 1,000 years, escaping persecution in Egypt at the time. Obviously, Sunnis and Shiites and Greek Orthodox have been there for more than 1,000 years and more. We were just talking yesterday that the Shiites of Lebanon helped reconvert, in a way, Safavid Iran into Twelver Shiism several centuries ago. So you start with very deep roots, almost too deep, which complicate life. The modern story of Lebanon is very much the story of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I and a connection between the Maronites, who are Catholics, hence have had historic relations since the days of the Crusades with the French monarchy, and then the French Republic and the Vatican as well. And that relationship after World War I, in the Paris peace talks, and then the French mandates over Lebanon and Syria, created modern Lebanon, which took the original mountain area, which was what is traditionally called Mount Lebanon, and added to it a number of coastal and plain areas in order to create food security, interestingly enough, for the country. And that's the Lebanon that was created in 1920. It was a mix of Muslims and Christians, Sunnis and Shiites and Druze and Maronites and Orthodox and Protestants and whatnot. The governing formula of this new country had been effectively innovated back in 1861. Without getting too much into details, it was a formula in which different religious communities would have quotas of representation in a governing council. That was under the Ottomans, and then that was transferred into the new constitution in 1926 and has been the governing formula of Lebanon for the past century, a consociational democracy, as you mentioned, in which power is shared. Currently, the parliament has a 50-50 representation of Muslims and Christians, and then within that, how many Maronites, how many Orthodox, how many Sunnis, all of that is spelled out. The president is always a Maronite Christian, the speaker of parliament is always a Shiite Muslim, the prime minister is always a Sunni Muslim. That is probably the only country in the world which has this system in such detail. It's interesting to note that after the invasion of Iraq and the fall of Saddam, Iraq adopted a lot of these formulas, for better or for worse. Not in the exact form, but it was a similar formula that was adopted. Lebanon was as you mentioned, a fairly stable and prosperous place for much of the 20th century. But it was hit hard, like much of the region was, in 1948 by the establishment of the State of Israel. Palestinian refugees, a lot of Palestinian refugees came to Lebanon as well as to Syria and Jordan and other countries surrounding Israel. And initially, the Arab-Israeli conflict was a state-to-state conflict, which Lebanon was not much directly involved in. And while other Arab countries in the 50s and 60s fell to military coups and socialist reforms, a lot of private capital escaped Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and sought refuge in Lebanon. So it became the Dubai of the Middle East of that time. Banking, business, tourism, and the rest of it. It was a very liberal place, both economically and politically, with this power-sharing formula that lasted for a fair amount of time. When the Arab-Israeli conflict ceased to be a state-to-state conflict, and that really began, I would say, in the grand defeat of 1967, when the Arab states realized, well, we're not going to be able to do this as states. So there was a last attempt in 1973 from Egypt and Syria, which led to a separate Egyptian peace. But what happened is that the Arab states instead supported the PLO in order to transfer the fight into a guerrilla fight between PLO freedom fighters or guerrilla fighters and Israel rather than state to state. Originally, the location of the PLO was in Jordan. The Jordanian Hashemite king had a war basically with the Palestinians in 1970, and they relocated to Lebanon. And from 1970 to 75, Lebanon became the center of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, dragged Lebanon into all kinds of conflicts. The PLO became heavily armed and independent in Lebanon, much like Hezbollah is today, supported by many of the Arab states instead of them fighting themselves. And for many complicated reasons, the country collapsed, drifted into civil war of about 15 years duration, which pretty much devastated the country, the economy, and the rest of it. The PLO was driven out of Lebanon in 1982 as a result of the Israeli invasion in 1982. The Lebanese war itself ended pretty much coincidentally with the end of the Cold War, so ended basically in 1990. And that is not a coincidence, because that was a time when the U.S. could finally work with some of the Soviet Union's old friends, like Syria, to cobble together a war-ending agreement, which was known as the Taif Agreement, and to usher in a period of post-war peace and reconstruction in Lebanon, which lasted pretty much from 1990 to 2005. So that was kind of the trajectory of, approaching where we are today. What it was like to grow up in Lebanon in the 60s and 70s, as I said, it was a beautiful place. It was where everybody wanted to be. My dad was at the American University of Beirut, and we have Dr. Penrose here, whose father was the president of AUB. There are other American and French universities there. It was a center of, as I said, banking and all kinds of trade and tourism as well. All that began to collapse in 1970, finally collapsed in 1975. Then I spent the next 15 years in the Civil War. So it was a very different Lebanon. That the second part of growing up in Lebanon was mainly one of conflict. The post-war period in Lebanon had two main phases. The first phase between 1990 and 2005 was a phase basically of Syrian occupation or Syrian control and management. This was not necessarily in conflict with the U.S. or Saudi Arabia. It was kind of a gentleman's agreement in a sense, that Syria would kind of manage the politics of Lebanon and would have Rafiq Hariri, who was a Saudi citizen, lead the economic reconstruction. But at the same time, Syria, in cooperation with Iran, enabled Hezbollah to really begin to build up its force in Lebanon between 1990 and 2005. There was a big uprising in 2005. The Syrians withdrew. And between 2005 and 2023, It's been a turbulent period where Hezbollah really has tried to maintain dominance of the country, but other groups through elections and other means have tried to maintain some autonomy and independence as well. Since 2019, it's been an exceptionally difficult time. In 2019, the economy collapsed. This was the result of over 30 years of deficit spending, accumulation of debt, high interest rates, a typical kind of Ponzi scheme type of public financing. The private banks were part of it, effectively living off of high interest rates. The chickens came home to roost in 2019. The currency collapsed. The banks closed, basically. People's money and savings in the banks were locked in the banks. They could not have access to them. Without a banking system, the economy screeched to a halt. And since 2019, the country has been in very, very dire economic straits. It used to be a middle-income country with a large middle class. It is now a country with about 80% under the poverty line, which is unheard of for a country like Lebanon. There was a major blast in August 2020 that I'm sure you're aware of in the Port of Beirut, which is the biggest peacetime blast that I'm aware of. It killed several thousand people, injured many, many more, devastated the entire port and about a quarter of the capital. What exploded was fertilizer materials, which is also used for explosives, probably some of it there for use in barrel bombs in Syria and other places. There's been no investigation, no accountability for anything, neither economic nor corruption nor blasts. There were elections a couple of years ago where the opposition did fairly well. So currently we have a parliament which is split between Hezbollah and its allies on one hand and a disparate group of opposition groups on the other. Neither has enough of a majority to push their agenda through. That has left us a bit paralyzed as a governing structure, without a president, without a functioning government for at least a year. Since October, obviously, Lebanon has been dragged into the Israel war with Gaza. Hezbollah has escalated on the Lebanese-Syrian border. But maybe I've said too much in my opening barrage. I will stop there.
That's a great introduction. And of course, there are so many Lebanese who have come to America, other parts of the world, and have contributed a lot to our societies. You were telling me last night a great story about when your father was foreign minister meeting President Reagan. That might put a little texture to this. Tell us that story.
I will tell the story. So my dad was foreign minister in the 1980s. If you recall, that obviously the time of the Reagan administration, Secretary Schultz. After the 82 invasion, the U.S. Sent troops to Lebanon as part of a multinational force. So the U.S. was very engaged in Lebanon. And the interesting anecdote, my father was on a visit to Washington, among many visits, because Lebanon was high on the priority list of the Reagan administration. And he had the good fortune to get a one-on-one meeting with President Reagan. And the president's team said, Mr. Foreign Minister, President Reagan is a bit older. He might not be very focused or concentrated. Lebanon is a complicated country, just so you know that, might be a bit challenging. So my father took that into account, and he went into the meeting and he delved straight into explaining the complex situation and the Druze and the Maronites and the Sunnis in Israel and PLO, PLO and all the complexities. And President Reagan was really looking at him very intently. And my dad was thinking, this is great. They said he can't focus. He's zeroed in on me. He's listening to every word. And after this long exposition, my dad finished and sat back, to see what the president would say. And the president said, I got it. And Dad said, you know what? He said, you remind me of Danny Thomas. So like many in the Middle East, the idea was America's not a fully reliable ally.
Couldn't resist the story. So you mentioned Hezbollah becoming an important part of the government. How did they insinuate themselves, and how did they morph into perhaps a more militant phase than they started out?
Well, the story of Hezbollah is linked to obviously the Islamic Revolution in Iran, obviously, and the awakening, what you might call a Shiite awakening, after you might say Shia centuries of being sidelined or not very empowered. It was also one of the major Islamist revolutions in the Middle East in general. So Islamist groups, other than the Shiite Islamist groups, were also awakened. It's interesting to note that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, revolutions were done by leftists or communists or Che Guevara types. That's what revolution meant. To have a revolution led by an 80-year-old religious figure was such a shock and so unusual for a Middle East whose coups and revolutions were all leftist, socialist, secular, communist, and the rest of it. Obviously, this created a big shift in the Shiite community in Lebanon, as well as other Shiite communities around the Middle East, around the Islamic world, that they had a tremendously inspiring example of a major revolution against colonialism and Western imperialism and all the rest of it, and against a very repressive regime of the Shah. That was inspiring in general, but particularly inspiring for Shiite Muslims, because the revolution in the end was led by a Shiite Muslim cleric and a religious figure and had a religious tone to it. It's interesting that the Shiite community in Lebanon previously had been major players in the communist parties or the Arab nationalist parties or socialist parties. But after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, obviously, this was a very new and very powerful movement. And Iran itself, as part of its constitution, its revolution, its orientation, had this idea that this revolution must be exported and they must invest abroad, and they certainly must invest in brotherly Shiite communities. So they extended a hand of support, training, and all the rest of it to the Shiites of Lebanon, which quickly became what we now know as Hezbollah. And that began to build steam in 80, 81, 82. Interesting that in the Israeli perspective, and I dare say in the American perspective, both as relates to Hezbollah and apropos of where we are today, Hamas, if you go back to that period of the late 70s, the US regarded Islamist movements as basically anti-communist and anti-Soviets, and hence probably our friends. Now, Iran was a bit different, but you recall that in Afghanistan, we supported the Islamists because we thought, they would be friends. We considered, obviously, Saudi Arabia a friend. And Israel as well, its main enemy was the PLO. And so having an Islamist movement and so on come in and begin to compete with the PLO was something that originally Israel was favorable to, because it would weaken the PLO, as it originally did. And when Israel invaded in 1982 and removed the PLO, there wasn't much resistance in the Shiite community because they wanted the PLO out. And then Hezbollah began to build its presence. Hezbollah's strategic role, it's important to understand, for Iran and for Syria. So why was it allowed to build up this capacity? For Iran, it's partly exporting the revolution and all that. But as we see up to the very moment where we are today, Iran considers Israel and the US its mortal enemies. So it needs deterrence and weapons against Israel and against the United States. So like we have aircraft carriers parked in the Gulf or the Mediterranean, Hezbollah is an aircraft carrier, if you want to call it that, parked on northern Israel. And that for them is a military asset in their contest with Israel. For Syria, why they enabled Hezbollah is that Syria remained for a long time in a long-term contest trying to regain the Syrian Golan Heights. And it needed also leverage on Israel to keep Israel uncomfortable and under pressure to at some point bring it back to the negotiating table to relinquish the Golan Heights. I think at this point that is no longer necessarily on the table, but Syria also enabled Hezbollah for those reasons. When the war ended in 1990, all the militias in Lebanon were disbanded and disarmed, except for Hezbollah, because that was a strategic asset for Syria and Iran, and they refused to accept those conditions. And that's, that was what was forced to be agreed upon. So in 1990, after the Ta'if agreement was signed and normalcy returned to Lebanon. Hezbollah continued to be armed and so on. Over time, Hezbollah realized it wanted to be also part of the political system, not just an armed group, in order to gain it leverage and protection and influence. So they indeed are a very organized political party. They now have members in parliament and people in the government and so on. And they effectively represent politically the Shiite community in Lebanon, which is about 1/3 of the population.
So how much leverage does the Lebanese government have over Hezbollah or vice versa?
It's more vice versa than the versa part and the first part, whatever the first part is. So the Lebanese government is not a unitary solid unit. It is a coalition government. So it is unable really, because it's not a solid unit, it's not a state that is governed by one faction or one person or one party or a military like other governments in the region. So it doesn't have the solidity to impose its will. In effect, Hezbollah is a partner in the government. What that means, in effect, is that the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army, in effect, and Hezbollah have to find ways and have found ways to coexist. It also means that a large group of the country, this opposition coalition that I talked about, which you might say represents about half of the country, is virulently opposed to Hezbollah and its influence and its military presence. But Hezbollah has the military capacity to kill people and assassinate people and threaten people. It has a lot of money and it has a lot of influence, and it, by virtue of its power, also has a lot of political allies. So it's a kind of a standoff in that sense.
So you mentioned Prime Minister Hariri earlier, who is a Saudi citizen. What relationship has Lebanon had over time with the Saudis? What's the connection there?
This connection is very strong, particularly economically. A lot of the fortunes in Lebanon, a lot of the business in Lebanon, especially when Saudi Arabia began to pick up economically, and particularly after the 70s with the rise in oil income and so on, much of Lebanese income began to come from Saudi Arabia, and as you know, a bit from the UAE and Qatar and other places. So a big economic role. Politically as well, for a lot of its modern history, when Prince Saud al-Faisal, who was the foreign minister, and Saudi Arabia's role in the Arab League was one of maintaining stability, compromise, managing the region, and not confrontational at all. And that meant that at many periods of Lebanon's different crises, including the Ta'if Agreement, which ended the civil war, Saudi Arabia was a big partner along with the US and negotiating with Syria to facilitate an end of the war and to bring about stability and peace. The arrival of Rafi al-Hariri, who was a Lebanese and Saudi citizen, represented a kind of agreement between Saudi Arabia and Syria and post-war Lebanon that Saudi Arabia would be the main economic partner of the country and Syria would be kind of the security guarantor or umbrella or manager of the system. And that lasted for a full 15 years, really until the US invasion of Iraq and the collapse of the US-Syrian relationship. So that lasted for a long time. So Saudi Arabia during that period was a friend, a guarantor of stability, of economic investment, would often put large deposits in the central bank when there was an economic crisis, would help in trade and so on, and helped with the Ta'if Agreement, as I mentioned. In recent times, with the new leadership in Saudi Arabia, it has been different, that Crown Prince MBS doesn't have the interest or the patience with that. He's more focused on things at home. He has not really found a partner in Lebanon. He did not find that the son of Rafi al-Hariri, Saad al-Hariri, was a credible partner. And largely Saudi Arabia has somewhat washed its hands of Lebanon for the time being. To end this note on Saudi Arabia, I would also say that the Sunnis of Lebanon, which is another third of the country, generally traditionally look to Saudi Arabia to get their, direction or their support or their orientation. And since Saudi Arabia has sort of washed its hands of the country, that's also put the Sunni community in a bit of a loss as to what are they doing and where are they going.
So that's the Saudi relationship. What about the American relationship? What is what American interest is there in a relationship with Lebanon?
Well, I will recommend a book that's coming out soon by Ambassador David Hale, who was an ambassador to Lebanon. The book is about the history of the American-U.S. relationship. It should be out in a few weeks. It's being published by MEI, actually, in cooperation with IB Tauris. So that is an excellent, detailed review of the relationship, really since the late 19th century up till the present day. To focus on the present day without going too far backwards, right now, I would say U.S., has a number of interests in Lebanon. Some of those are negative interests. And what I mean by that the U.S. has an interest that Lebanon does not completely collapse and become a Somalia or a Syria, or what Lebanon was between 1975 and 1990. That is one reason they desperately continue to support the Lebanese army, just to prop up basic stability in Lebanon. Because they're well aware that if Lebanon fully collapses, Hezbollah obviously will just have more power, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda are likely to come back to Lebanon, and there's likely to be streams of refugees, both Lebanese and Syrian, from Lebanon going to Cyprus and the European Union, and a whole bunch of headaches. So there's an interest in preventing that. There is an interest and a strong relationship between the Department of Defense and the Lebanese military, the Lebanese army. The Pentagon thinks very highly of the Lebanese army. They consider it maybe the second best man-for-man fighting force in the region. It's very small, it's a very lightly equipped army, but it's a very old and very strong relationship. So when you talk to the military, they have a very strong relationship with the LAF, the Lebanese Armed Forces. They fought together to drive Al-Qaeda and ISIS out of Lebanon a few years ago, and that was a very effective fight. And they're very aware that the army is what keeps Lebanon from complete collapse. The U.S. also has an interest in being in Lebanon, partly because of Syria and the current situation in Syria. It keeps them close to the Russian forces in Syria. It keeps them close to the ISIS and other potential terrorist groups in Syria, so that if the U.S. has to withdraw from Syria, which it might be doing soon, it has a position in Lebanon and can remain there. It's also a position on the Eastern Med, which has geopolitical and economic interests. There's a lot of offshore gas in the region. There's a lot of U.S. interest in that. And if you just look at the construction of the new U.S. embassy in Lebanon, and you can read about it online, it's the second biggest, I think, embassy construction project in the world today. So you figure this is not just because this is this little country here. There are larger interests. It's also, you might say, an American-Israeli interest to keep the Americans involved in Lebanon, to keep an eye on Hezbollah and other potential threats to Israel. So it's a bunch of those considerations. I would say it's supported by something you mentioned, Ambassador Jordan, earlier, that in Congress and in public opinion, the Lebanese Americans are a known community. They're successful, they're respected. So, of course, it is a foreign country, but Lebanon also has a lot of sort of goodwill in a lot of parts of the country and in Congress, and that helps.
Let's take it now to the current conflict in Gaza. And Lebanon's relationship with Israel has been fraught. There is a disputed border, and Hezbollah and the Israelis have been lobbing rockets, missiles, and other fire back and forth, at least along the border now. Where do you think Lebanon's role in that conflict is going to go, and what can be done to ameliorate the conflict?
Well, a bit of context that Lebanon, and again, I say Lebanon, it's not a unitary thing. It's different groups pulling for different things. But you mentioned my dad. My dad in 1982 and 83, with U.S. mediation, negotiated a Lebanese-Israeli withdrawal agreement for the Israelis to withdraw from Lebanon. That was not a peace treaty, but it could have been a preamble for an eventual negotiation over peace between Lebanon and Israel. That withdrawal agreement, which was not a peace agreement, but a withdrawal agreement, was opposed violently by the Soviet Union, Iran, and Syria. Syria opposed it because it did not want we did not want Lebanon to sign a separate peace with Israel while they still have the Golan occupied. So they didn't want Lebanon to go alone because they wanted, so they prevented that from happening. Iran did not want peace to happen in southern Lebanon because they needed their aircraft carrier. They needed a place to park a military group, and hence peace would be very much against their national security interests as they see them. So they opposed it. The Soviet Union opposed it because it was an American agreement. And Soldatov, I think was his name, he was the Soviet ambassador in Beirut at the time. Again, to tell you an anecdote from my dad's days, he came to my father and said, Eli, my dad's name was Eli, said, Eli, I'm sorry. I know what you're trying to do. It makes sense for Lebanon, and I, otherwise would wish you luck. But unfortunately, my job is to oppose this agreement because it's done through America. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to scuttle it. And indeed, that's what happened. So the absence of peace between Lebanon and Israel is for wider strategic geopolitical reasons, and at the time, the Soviet Union itself. So today, so what that means, first of all, the backdrop is that Hezbollah and Iran cannot afford peace with Israel. They don't want it. I was at the Doha Forum a few weeks ago, and they had the Iranian Foreign Minister, Amir Abdullahian, in by video. And he said, there's one thing we and the Israeli government agree on. But it was, what? Do you agree on something? This Israeli government and us agree on one thing. And I said, well, what was it? He said, we both oppose a two-state solution. Meaning for the Iranians, they cannot afford a resolution, neither to the Palestinian issue, nor to the Lebanese, any peace with Israel. So when the conflict broke out on October 7, Hamas is an ally of Hezbollah and Iran, was armed and trained partially by them, and much of the lessons that you saw displayed to great violent effect on October 7 were lessons that had been learned by Hezbollah and the Iranians and Houthis in different battles. But Hezbollah and Iran, as far as we know, were not informed, would not have approved of this type of attack, and were not happy with the result of it. But they are allies. They were dragged into it. And the instructions and the reaction of the Iranians, and they said it out loud, is that we're going to activate all of our assets, which is Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, and the Houthis, to raise the pressure on Israel and to raise the pressure on the U.S. that backs this, Israeli operation in Gaza. And that is, in fact, what's happened. For Hezbollah, that's meant using, sort of escalating the cross-border attacks from their side on Israel, and of course, Israel from their side on the Lebanese side. But both sides do not, and are very clearly do not want a war or a major war. The Israelis definitely don't want it because it would be way too costly and would not have a clear outcome. Hezbollah doesn't want it because, first of all, that's not their function. Their function is to remain as a deterrent in case Iran is threatened, not if Gaza is threatened. But they have to keep up the pressure on Israel, keep up appearances, so they're escalating in this way. What recently has become clear is that Israel has clarified that they have one specific demand of Hezbollah, that they want Hezbollah to withdraw its elite fighting forces from the immediate border area and withdraw a few positions so that Hezbollah cannot stage an overnight attack like suddenly, like Hamas did. So they're not asking much more than that. They know that Hezbollah has over 100,000 missiles and is an immense force. They're not asking anything there. They're just saying, we want you to move away a bit from the border. Currently, the U.S. is the main mediator on this issue. Amos Hochstein is the person most engaged. He is the U.S. State Department envoy for energy and globally. He previously negotiated a tricky but very important maritime border agreement between Lebanon and Israel, effectively between Hezbollah and Israel, which is a first, in order for them to both exploit their offshore gas resources. So he has success. And he's been going back and forth now in Lebanon to try to negotiate some kind of revised border agreement. So I expect this not to happen anytime soon. I think as long as the war in Gaza is going on, Hezbollah needs to maintain a fair level of activity. But I don't expect a full-scale war, and eventually I expect some kind of quiet agreement that would see this round of conflict over.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience for questions now. We have a couple of microphones, one back here. And we've got questions here. These two in the front row we'll start with. So if we could have a mic down here to the front. These two gentlemen right here. So we take them first.
Great talk. Thanks. I'm wondering how the Lebanese military is, I guess, fractured between the normal Lebanese government and the Hezbollah portion of it. Is it a clear demarcation, or is it just both parties just, have a gentleman agreement? And how is it also through the ranks from the top to the bottom?
Quick answer. The Lebanese army is a separate, independent, autonomous, whatever you want to call it. It's a regular looking army with regular command and control. It doesn't have Hezbollah in it or any direct connection with Hezbollah. It does answer to the Lebanese government and the Lebanese authorities. Obviously, there's a lot of Shiite officers, Sunnis, Christians. It's a mixed army, like any army. But as an army, it's very traditional looking and very, standard in that sense. Hezbollah has its completely own military establishment and intelligence network and defense and so on. They definitely do not share anything with the Lebanese armed forces because they don't want their secrets or whatever they're doing to be known. It's whether you call it a gentleman's agreement or whatever it is, there are areas like the southern suburbs of Beirut or some parts of South Lebanon or the Bekaa Valley where there is a very strong Hezbollah presence, where the Lebanese army might be there, but it does not challenge Hezbollah. It doesn't, threaten Hezbollah. The bottom line, the reality is that if any Lebanese army commander attempted to, and this many outside players say, well, why doesn't the Lebanese army take on Hezbollah? You have guns, they have guns, let's fight it out. The Lebanese army would immediately collapse and split apart and would not be able to survive that. And the country would sink into civil war. So that's the reality which any Lebanese army commander has to be aware of. It's almost like saying to an, U.S. Army commander, would you attack, I don't know, Kansas, or would, that's not something that's doable in the internal politics of Lebanon.
And there's a huge hidden factor to the whole Muslim world conundrum is what I'm thinking about. And can you tell the audience, first of all, what the percentage of Muslims are Shiites, what percentage of them are Sunnis or other denomination? Because we make a lot about Shiites. We talk about them, most people don't know what the difference is. And secondly, I have a personal question. How about the Shah of Iran? Was he a Shiite or was he not? I don't remember that.
I think he was a Shiite, yes, the Shah of Iran. In Lebanon, at least, although we famously have not had a population census since 1932, so my figures, it's been a while, so, But what we do have is accurate citizenship rolls. A census is different. A census, you go village to village and see who's where. But we do know, the government does know who is a Lebanese citizen. What we don't know is this Lebanese citizen currently in Brazil, or is he in Lebanon, or is he in Saudi Arabia? Well, that requires a census. In the voter rolls, which are important, that who can vote today in a Lebanese election, it's about 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So Sunni 1/3, Shiite 1/3, Christians altogether, Maronites, Orthodox, so on 1/3. But in terms of who actually shows up to vote, and there you get a sense of maybe these people are not in the country because you can't, it's probably closer to 40-40-20, meaning 40% Sunni, 40% Shiite, and then maybe 20% actually Christians still in the country. Population growth in the Sunni and Shia, in other words, number of kids per family and all of that, in the Sunni and Shia communities is much higher than in the Christian community. So that ratio is increasing to shift in that direction, while political power in parliament and in government remains 50-50 Christian-Muslim. Overshadowing all of this demography is the enormous Syrian refugee demography. The biggest single child production in Lebanon, or whatever the accurate word is, from Syrian refugees, not Lebanese Sunnis or Lebanese Shias or Lebanese Christians. There's about 1.5 million Syrians in Lebanon, and that's about as many Shiites as there are, as many Sunnis, as many Christians. So, and those Syrians are getting much more, I mean, they're growing fast, and they're not going home, probably ever. That's a whole nother, now they don't vote, so they don't directly show up in the political system.
Okay, back here on the back row, next to the wall. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. This has been very, very informative. So 2 questions. Probably the harder one first. What's the perception in Lebanon, man on the street, if you will, and I realize that's a tough ask, of the current U.S. administration, right? Is the Biden administration perceived as weak, strong? Let's just stick with that one question. Thank you very much.
The man or woman on the street, a huge variety of opinions. The country is, not surprisingly, like the US, extremely split. So it depends who you ask. There's about, the allies of Hezbollah generally consider the US an enemy. So whether it's Trump or Biden, it's, it's bad, and, they're allies of Israel and all of that. The other half, I would definitely have a more sanguine view of the US in general. But then what's their view of Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump probably reflects what you've asked an American. I think Biden is not viewed as certainly very forceful. Trump was viewed as very erratic. Definitely the US has not been able for 20 years maybe to project an image in terms of its leadership of stability, reliability, clarity, and so on, where you've had a Mr. Putin, a Mr. Erdogan, a Mr. Xi, at least recently. The U.S., keeps continuing to, flip from one orientation to another. Underlying all of that, like much of the Middle East, everybody wants to be in the U.S. and wants to go to the U.S. and wants a U.S. education and loves the U.S. Even, those who hate the U.S. as a political enemy, but could you get me a visa, please? And that's interesting in terms of the U.S. I mean, the U.S. has, you call that soft power. People don't want a visa to China or to Russia or to Turkey, but, they'll criticize the U.S. all day, and then they want to go to the U.S.
Actually, that's Paul, thank you for this really great informative talk. The perfect segue to my first question. Actually, I have 3. Could you tell us more about the Lebanese diaspora? I think, there are Lebanese, everywhere, every corner of the globe. And I'm just curious if the diaspora, of which I guess you're a member, what influence they have back home. And you mentioned briefly, I don't know if the audience knows this, 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a refugee.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this is enormous. I think Lebanon has, as a proportion, the largest refugee community population in the world. Final question goes back to my what we were talking about before the program. You didn't say a thing about the French or the Europeans. I mean,
that indicative of today's reality?
They
Okay, I'll
were
say
once a
something.
great power, and I think they had the mandate over that region at one point.
Yes. The diaspora started in the late 19th century for 2 reasons. One, sort of a pull and a push. The pull is that American, well, first of all, Catholic education through the Vatican and through the French, well, through the Vatican initially and the Jesuits and others had begun to penetrate, let's call it that Ottoman part of the world, and priests began to go to Rome and be educated there. In other words, beginning of westernization started with the Maronite priesthood. Then a few crazy American missionaries showed up in the 1860s and said, we want to start, a missionary school and teach in English. And that's eventually became AUB. And that began to educate and westernize a lot of people there. The French freaked out when they saw the Protestants in the country. So they quickly said, we'll send a mission and we'll start building a university, which is St. Joseph University. So there was a competition on Western education. So the pull is that you have a part of the Ottoman Empire that was beginning to get this education and to realize, wow, there's a West out there and they're doing well and maybe we should go there. The push was an economic push and relates, interestingly, a little bit to the US Civil War, interestingly enough. And it relates a bit to the French, that in the 19th century, with French middlemen and traders and so on, the Mount Lebanon economy began to transition to a monoculture silk industry. It became one of the big global exporters of silk through Marseille and French traders and investors and so on, but most of the economy transitioned to silk. And particularly during the, it was competing also silk and cotton and things of that nature. After the end of the Civil War here, with the rise of Chinese silk and so on, the silk industry completely collapsed. And so this once wealthy Mount Lebanon middle class, which had also become educated, became destitute. So they just got on boats and got the hell out of there. And the diaspora started then. To the Americas, to Europe, eventually to Australia. And when I say Americas, that includes Brazil and Argentina. My own great-grandfather emigrated to Buenos Aires in Argentina and died in Argentina. And once you had that diaspora there, obviously they began to pull relatives and it began to build over time. And it is maybe along with the Jewish diaspora, the biggest diaspora in the world, maybe per capita, it's the biggest one in the world, I don't know. I think also a people who never really had a functioning government. They were very resourceful and very much relying on their own powers. So they were very successful wherever they landed. They were tough, self-made people. And it is now one of the biggest, wealthiest diasporas in the world. Its influence inside the country is very, very slim. That's been a challenge, for many Lebanese, including the diaspora. It has some influence, but really very little. There have been, Well, Carlos Slim is a famous example of a famous or infamous cello escaping fellow, very successful, part of that diaspora. Not much influence. There have been many proposals how to increase that influence, what to do, but so far not much. Yeah, the refugee population is huge. I had mentioned earlier the Palestinian refugee population, which came in 48 and partly dragged the country into, Israel-Palestine and then a civil war. But now the Syrian refugee population is much larger, obviously. It is less of a immediate challenge and threat, I would say. And I say that because there's always been at least 500,000 Lebanese in Syria as laborers. It is a little bit like other, work migrants that the entire construction sector, agriculture sector, the low-income labor has been for decades done by Syrians, not by Lebanese. Now they brought their families because their house was bombed in Syria, so there's a lot more people, but the economic relationship is similar. The burden it's placing is on the infrastructure for those families, meaning the schools. These kids need to go to school. They need, public health, clinics, water. That's where the strain is coming. On the French, I did mention the French 100 years ago in the Treaty of the Paris Peace Talks, French mandate and the French role in creating what was called Le Grand Liban, Greater Lebanon at the time. And they remain, obviously, of the European players, they're the most engaged, most involved. And even in this latest crisis, they and the Americans are the ones that are most engaged. I would say the distribution of roles is that the French have the bandwidth and the interest and the time to send a lot of envoys and to get busy. The Americans occasionally will send something. Secretary Blinken speaks French and, has good relations with the French government. So there's a lot of coordination. They often allow the French, you go figure out the details and we'll do some of the heavy lifting. So the French are still involved in Lebanon. They have increasing economic interests and a lot of people critique them for that. They got a contract for the port, reconstruction of the port, and sort of a container with CCMG or whatever that company, the French company, is called. They've bought or been sold the post, the private postal system, and they want also to be in Lebanon in order to be positioned for the day when there's reconstruction in Syria, so that French companies could be there. They are also one of the three companies, along with the Italian company Eni and the Qatari petroleum company. They're the ones looking for offshore gas in Lebanese. So they have business interests. The US, it's too small of a market. They don't really care for that. So they let the French pick up those tidbits. So that's a few words about the French. Did them justice.
Thank you. So you mentioned that the United States seems to be only interested in a semblance of statu quo in Lebanon in order not to let the situation get worse. But in the perception of the Lebanese, talking about the perception of the men and women in the street about the United States, we always think that the United States is the savior, right? They are the only ones who are going to come and save us. So it seems like they're not going to save us because they're only interested in a statu quo. So given this discrepancy in how we perceive who's going to help us, and we also think as Lebanese that we are resilient, so we just adapt to whatever happens and we do nothing about it, we are in a situation where there's no hope, it seems like it. So what's your opinion about this?
Yeah, I share your perception that a lot of Lebanese think somebody's going to save us, right? The French, the Pope, the Americans, somebody. That's, people have to take care of themselves. Nobody's going to save us per se. The American position is not status quo. They don't want things to get worse, but they want things to get better. They want progress on election of a president. They want progress on formation of a government. An agreement with the IMF, reform of the banks, relaunch of the economy. They're not going to do it for us, but they want Lebanon to resume the functions of a normal, healthy, functioning state to the degree that's possible with Hezbollah. They are realists. They're aware that they are not going to remove Hezbollah. Israel couldn't remove Hezbollah. That is going to have to await some change in Tehran or something else has to happen. So they want the situation to improve, and they're using leverage and diplomatic efforts along with the French and the Qataris and the Saudis and the Egyptians to try to get our various factions to agree on a president, to form a government. They have, along with the international community, billions of dollars waiting to put into Lebanon in order to allow us to restart the economy. They can be very helpful with the governments of the Gulf to merge and restructure our banking system so that we can have a banking system and stabilize our currency. They were crucial in negotiating the maritime agreement with the Israelis so that we could get our offshore gas. So no, they are good partners. They want things to improve to the degree that they have bandwidth and time, and they do their part. The obstacle so far has been really in Lebanon, largely in Hezbollah, obviously, but also, the complexity of elections in Lebanon. So that's how I would describe it. I think there is hope. The hope is limited in the sense that Hezbollah, currently, there's no solution for that crippling problem. It's a crippling, but it's not a small problem. But that aside, there's no reason why we can't have a stable currency, functioning economy, fairly normal life. That can continue as it had been in the past, even with Hezbollah there, until such day that something happens in Tehran and we can actually have an actual state, which is now far in the future.
So you mentioned that almost 80% are in poverty, and then as well as with the refugees, what humanitarian aids were happening before October 7th, and how has that affected any humanitarian aid that since then?
Well, the humanitarian aid and the collapse that I mentioned was from 2019. So it's been there for 4 or 5 years. And the humanitarian aid was built up over those years during that time. The aid to the Syrian refugees dates all the way back to 2013, 2014, a decade ago, when the U.S., the international community, and others have an organized system to help the Syrian refugees. The U.S. and the international community scrambled after 2019 to help the Lebanese population, and they have. I don't have the numbers top of mind, but it's significant, and they are main drivers in providing basic support. For the Lebanese, something that is significant about the diaspora is that because of the enormous diaspora, there's very few families in Lebanon who don't have a cousin or somebody either in Saudi Arabia or Brazil or Canada or France or somewhere who isn't sending money back to the family. So unlike some other countries where if your national income disappears, that's it. There is a big diaspora that continues to pour money into the country. It's estimated that about $5 to $6 billion comes into the country every year from the diaspora out of a GDP, which is currently maybe, I don't know we haven't had any accurate studies, but maybe it's 20 billion or 22 billion. 6 billion of that is just people sending money home. So that helps. Yeah.
Yes, Stuart.
Thank you for being here today. I hope you enjoy your stay in Dallas. I was taught by a Lebanese man that back 100-odd years ago, that there were dominant Christians and minority number of Muslim. I don't remember 60-40, 70-30. By about 1973, that switched. And then there were more Muslim and now increasingly more, and like a reverse, maybe now 60 Muslim 40 or 70-30. Back when the Christians were kind of running it, there were 3 families, Franjai, Shedjak, and Jamil. What has become of their leadership among the Christians?
You know your Lebanese politics. So yeah, back in the 30s when the census was done, it was about 60-40 Christians in general, Muslims in general. And on that basis, the distribution of power at the time was fixed. Those numbers by the late 1950s no longer made sense. And that led to a brief civil war in 1958 and then a longer civil war in 1975. And a reform of the distribution of power in 1989 in the Taif Agreement from 60-40, or what was effectively 6-5 to be accurate, to 50-50. While recognizing, and all factions recognized, that the country is not 50-50. But the Muslims agreed and accepted that we get it, the Christians are a minority in the Muslim Middle East and they need a special reassurance and so on. So we'll agree to that. We'll let them have 50%, even though it's clear that Christians are not 50% of the population. It's also very important politically that by the 1990s, or 1990 itself, whereas previously you could talk about Muslims and Christians politically, you can no longer talk about Muslims politically, because Sunnis and Shias now are each other's worst enemies. It used to be Muslims and Christians used to go at it. Now the Christians are kind of everybody's friend and nobody really cares. It's the Sunnis and Shias that are their worst enemies. So in effect, it doesn't mean anything politically to say it's 70-30 Muslims and Christians, because the Muslims are no longer a political community. So you have to say politically, it's a third, a third, and a third. And that's currently the reality politically. The families that you mentioned, Franjiye, Jaja, Jmayil, are still, Shamaun is kind of no longer much present. Those families are still there, but the new players have been President Aoun and his new movement, which is kind of, for a while was the strongest among the Christians and was the last president and are still big players. So they're the new players on the block, I would say there.
Thank you. Are there Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon? And if so, when you had the Israeli war with them, there were no things of what we're hearing now in Hamas. We don't see people being, Hezbollah using people as human shields and digging tunnels and all of that mistreatment of their own people. Why is that?
Well, there's a few questions, I guess, nestled in your remark. One, Hezbollah does have tunnels, and they use them for their military purposes and so on. There are obviously Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. The estimate is maybe 150,000, 170,000 Palestinians still in Lebanon. Not a huge number. Many of them left to other places. There's been so the Palestinian camps are outside the control of the Lebanese government, and that is from an agreement of decades ago. So they have been fought over by various Palestinian factions. And you've seen fights between Hamas and Fatah, Hamas and the traditional PLO to control various, different refugee camps. You've also seen more extremist Islamist groups try to take over. The dynamic there is a bit opaque because each camp has its own sort of realities. Hezbollah has been trying to bring Hamas back in influence in some of the Palestinian camps now that Hezbollah is allied with Hamas. Hamas a few weeks ago announced that it wanted to start launching operations from Lebanon to Israel, and that caused a huge uproar in Lebanon. And then Hezbollah got Hamas to retract that statement and said, no, we misspoke. No, we're not going to do anything from Lebanon. But Hamas is certainly there in the camps. But whatever they do, it's under the control of Hezbollah. Hezbollah's fighting approach is maybe they taught a lot of the methods of the fighting, use of drones, use of those gliders and so on. They taught that to Hamas. But the way Hamas, the attack on civilians, the horrific brutality is more ISIS. It is definitely not Hezbollah's in its wheelhouse. It's not anything they did. It's not what they do. They think correctly that's the worst PR you could ever do other than being horrific in itself. So it's still a bit of a mystery to me why Hamas, ended up doing these horrific things, and that's a whole different discussion, but separate from Hezbollah. So, yeah, does that answer your question more or less? Yeah, thank you. They do have a lot of tunnels, though. Yeah.
Right here.
So sorry, excuse me.
Thank you very much. So I'm glad you mentioned the Lebanese diaspora because I myself on my mother's side am Lebanese. My great grandfather came from Lebanon to Mexico.
Mhm.
And one thing I was told a lot is that a lot of people from Lebanon and Palestine came to Latin America specifically. You mentioned Brazil and Argentina, and Mexico's another popular one. And just want to ask, why do you think so many immigrants from Lebanon would go to somewhere like Latin America?
Well, they're probably Latin American experts, but as far as I know, like countries like Argentina and Brazil in the 19th century were very promising, very wealthy, a lot of opportunities there. I'm not an expert on the economics of Latin America in the 19th century, but that's my impression in general. It's also the case that people leaving Lebanon in the 19th century really had no idea where they were going. And a lot of stories, they get on a boat from Lebanon, they go to Marseille or somebody, and then they catch a boat and they say, I want to go to America. Now, they didn't know much about it. And these truly, so you'll find Lebanese in like Barbados and other places. And the captain of the ship will say, we're in America, welcome to America. And they'd leave them there. And so a lot of it is just, they really knew they were villagers coming from Ottoman Empire at a time where they had pretty much zero information. And Latin America and Mexico was very attractive. A lot of fortunes could be made. A lot of fortunes were made. And they didn't know much about what is America,
Any student questions out here still that we haven't recognized? Student. Right here, yes.
So it seems like the U.S. tends to initially invest in a lot of relationships, but then we lose interest, we draw out, we stop funds, and that's when we see these extremists arise. And you already kind of talked about how we don't want that to happen. But then with her question, they're not going to do it for us. And there's funds waiting, you said, billions of dollars. how do we, I mean, how do we get to the point where the US can help again? How do we maintain that interest in the long run?
Well, the U.S. interest and presence in Lebanon is sustained. It is long run. It's not leaving. The obstacle has been mainly in Lebanon. The US, Qatar, France, Saudi, Egypt have tried to help the Lebanese, push the Lebanese, urge the Lebanese to pick a president, form a government. We're here. We want to help you. So I would not fault the US at this point for anything. You know, they're there, they're interested, they're offering, they're helping the army, they're helping the people. They're negotiating to avoid a major war on Lebanon. They helped us negotiate the maritime agreement so we could exploit the offshore gas. You know, thank you for what they're doing. The country is not doing what it should be doing, you know. Of course, I'm not blaming the people who are doing their best, but you have politicians, you have Hezbollah. So the obstacle, I would say the US and the international community is in a very good place and offering very good things and helping out, really. And it's sustained and it's not going away, thank God. But there things need to happen in Lebanon so that we can move forward.
One more question? Yes, there were the two back here. Let's finish those two, please. Just one question, two people, okay. Siamese.
The organization that I've not heard you mention, international in character, is the United Nations. They run the camps for the Palestinian refugees. How do you see their role turning into a more positive impact in the current situation?
Thank you. And the other question, take two questions?
No, they had just one question.
I was a joint question. Okay. Very UN-like, to have a joint resolution, yes. The UN currently, first of all, UNRWA, as you mentioned, the UN Relief Works for Asia, which is the one that cares for the Palestinian refugees. It has funding issues, you know, needs more funding. The Trump administration cut. Anyway, it's a long story. They play the critical role for the Palestinian refugees. The UN also is part of the mechanism of UN Resolution 1701, which tries to manage the border between Lebanon and Israel. There is a UN UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, with a number of governments from around the world offering troops, which along with the Lebanese army try to maintain stability across the Lebanese-Israeli border. Obviously, that's not working very well. The current negotiations and mediation by the Americans is to re-strengthen that resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 1701, and implement it more forcefully and get Hezbollah to withdraw more of its forces from that region, strengthen the Lebanese army, strengthen UNIFIL so that they can actually do a better role in keeping that border peaceful. And that is a place where the UN obviously has a big role. The UN currently does not exist as a political force because the UN Security Council does not exist. The US, France and Britain, whatever they agree on, Russia and China will oppose. So it used to be that you could raise things to the Security Council and get a good resolution and then maybe through Chapter 7 or something impose it. That is no longer an option. So that weakens the United Nations. The UN and various UN agencies, the World Food Program, many of the agencies, UNDP and others, play a very important role in humanitarian relief, in development, and governance. So the UN is extremely important as a set of institutions and different initiatives, even if as a global governance mechanism, as Security Council, it is absent.
And just on a concluding note, Paul, and maybe a note of hope, would you explain to the audience what is on the cover of our program? And up there, okay, great.
So on the cover is a statue. It's an artwork. I don't know who the Lebanese artist is. It is obviously a young woman with a figure of hope and defiance. It is made of the shards left by the August 20 port explosion, pieces of metal, pieces of glass. And the backdrop there is the devastated port of Beirut. It reflects the fact that after the port explosion was a second wave of mass protest led by not only young people, but young people played a big role, protesting against the corrupt governing elite and against Hezbollah, who held nobody accountable. There's been no investigation. Nobody held accountable for the detonation of the country's entire port. Zero, let alone accountability for the banks, for the, anything. So this represents the Lebanese protest movement against their political class, against political corruption, against the absence of accountability. It remains as it is. There has been still no accountability, although the people demand it.
The name of the artist is behind in the program.
Oh.
And if you would like to know more, in the back part, it's a QR code that if you scan it with your phone, it takes you to the artist and also other resources that you want to use.
Thank you, Astrid.
Thank you.
Thanks, Astrid. And Paul, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Bob.
Middle East Institute's website is mei.edu if you want more information.